thou didst incorporate, and on the map you now have been since 1814. God grant that what we do and say may bring thee honor here today. How oft we like to recollect, and some things view in retrospect, the mills that stood on Hancock Brook, where logs were sawed and men made shook, the whistling of the narrow gauge, the covered bridge, its dark passage, the water from the bullring rub, the kids and clothes it helped to scrub. O Hiram, Maine, O Hiram, Maine, we'll sing thy praise in fond refrain. We love the views from mountain tops, the Sacco's flow that never stops, Mount Cutler's cliffs, the Ossipee, the deer that roam Mount Misery. O little town, our love for thee will manifest eternally. We love thy homes and stately woods, the unique names of neighborhoods, your highest mountain, Bill Merrill, the scenic views from Hiram Hill, the places with unclaimed renown, from Buttermilk to Durgan Town, and where two women had a scrap became then known as Tear Cap. O Hiram, Maine, O Hiram, Maine, we'll sing thy praise in sweet refrain. We gather here to celebrate the things we should commemorate. Thou hast endured wind, fire, and flood. Thy sons have shed heroic blood. Dear native town of modest fame, God keep thee e'er from harm or shame. My name is Davy Sturtevant. I'm proud to be a transplanted resident of Hiram, Maine. The song O Hiram, Maine was written for Hiram's sesquicentennial celebrations in 1964. The lyrics were written by Paul Wadsworth, a descendant of Brigadier General Peleg Wadsworth, the principal founder of Hiram, and, to us, the General.
Hi, and welcome to the program Faces of Founders, Hiram, Maine, a partnership of Hiram Historical Society and the Sacopee Valley High School of SAD55. I am Sally Williams, president of Hiram Historical Society and town historian. Our partner is Mrs. Sandra Taylor, teacher of the class Sacopee TV2. The program is based on the book, a new history book, Faces of Founders, Hiram, Maine, which intends to bring the founders to life. The program was originally conceived as a live production, theatrical production, in the Art Center. COVID canceled all that. The school then graciously agreed to help us modify it for production in the school. In this production, students read brief profiles of 15 of the founders. Mrs. Taylor, as moderator, presents their facts. The founders then present their opinions. They speak freely in their own voices or the voices of their wives and children. As you listen, try to visualize the hardships they faced, the deprivations, the dangers as they cut through the forest to create a new sustainable town. For this production, we thank Mr. Britton Wolf, principal of Sacopee Valley High School, for his support and promotion of it. We thank Mrs. Taylor for leading it, and we thank all those who participated.
Brigadier General Peleg Wadsworth was born in 1748 in Duxbury, Mass. He graduated from Harvard College in 1769 with a B.A. and in 1772 with a master's, after he taught school with his best mate, Alexander Scammell. He was an officer in the Revolutionary War and served with another American patriot, Paul Revere, who turned out to be a better silversmith than a general. After the war, he settled in Portland and was elected a U.S. congressman. He represented the District of Maine from 1793 to 1807, when he decided not to run for office again, instead retiring to his farm in Hiram. Though his was not a grant in the way we usually think of grants as gifts, his was the largest of the 4 so-called grants in Hiram: the Prescott Grant, Waters Grant, Cutler Grant, and Wadsworth Grant, and he had the most influence. He was not a tall man, but he had a military presence that commanded attention and respect. He set the tone, and others followed. In his time in Hiram, he built a mansion and farm, built and purchased sawmills and grist mills, loaned money to settlers in need as coin was scarce, dealt justice as justice of the peace, offered services to paupers as overseer of the poor, assessed land and real property, laid out roads as selectman and assessor, and in general, no pun intended, was the leader of the town. Peleg Wadsworth was the principal founder of Hiram. Also his son Charles, who settled on the high land Peleg gave him and his bride Ruth Clemens in 1795, before most other people came to Hiram. Timothy Cutler received a grant of land 2 years before Peleg purchased his, but he was 13 years older and was not active in town affairs. Peleg saw and presided over much of the progress in developing Hiram. There were 18 families when Peleg began his involvement with Hiram and 175 when he died. There were no schoolhouses when he arrived and 13 when he died. Because a general is so important to the development of Hiram, his introduction and his profile in this production is longer than the others to follow. Relax and enjoy the show and marvel at our founding men and women.
Brigadier General Peleg Wadsworth here. I've been asked to say something of what it was like in Hiram in 1790, when I bought 7,800 acres of land here. That's a tall order. I can't possibly convey to you the difficulties and dangers we faced. The pain in a nascent community of losing good men and women in accidents, disease, and war. Nor can you understand the exhilaration we felt of converting that looming forest into a productive town with nothing but our bare hands and a few tools. It took 16 years from the time I became involved in Hiram to finally become a voting resident. But I had been planning it all the time. I was elected to the U.S. Congress. It was a long, rough ride to New York and Philadelphia and back. The roads were terrible. I felt obligated to sell 100-acre lots of my land to attract settlers, and I did, along with Mr. Cutler, planning my farm in-house, keeping up with the science of agriculture and property management. There were 18 families when I bought my land, and by 1800, in only 10 years, there were 43 to 173 people. We just kept growing. I had to rely on the mail to instruct my son Charles, who was running the farm then, and to hear his news. Hiram was all forest with huge pines waiting to be cut down and floated to Portland, or sawed into lumber to build houses and barns here. I was 59 years old when I moved to Hiram that cold day, January 1st, 1807, and tried to make a small government work. I brought skills that others lacked: surveying for roads, legal advice, organizing militias, and how to lead. I had education, all-important vision that most of the early settlers did not. The settlers were hard-working souls. They cared more than I, laid out roads and paid my taxes and ran town meetings than I knew General Washington. I must have served in every office in the town: selectman, treasurer, assessor, juror, justice of the peace, overseer of the poor, committee this and committee that. At times, recruiting for these offices required some arm twisting. I was a hog rev at age 63 when my neighbors thought they were too old to farm. Do you know how hard it is to catch a hog? They don't have necks like horses and cattle and sheep. There's nothing to grab onto. They have to be wrestled to the ground. I was fit, and at age 80, I was able to climb onto my horse and ride through town to invite people to my new school. Free to good little boys, I shouted. I'm sure I meant good little girls, too. I treat people fairly and justly and expect the same in return. I am generous, too. And I loan my farm animals and my money coin to farmers in need. But there was that Coolbroth fellow that took my best horse and saddle that I had loaned him, and he sold them in Buxton and went drinking. I brought the full wrath of my fury upon him. No one should take advantage like that. I also tried to help the Negro orphans Sambo Foddy in Portland. I paid for his indenture for 7 years, and in return I was to teach him to read, to farm, and give him 2 sets of clothes, one for work and one for the Lord's Day. But he didn't work out. I don't know what happened to him. It's possible that a city boy of 14 didn't adjust well to farm life and made his way back to his people in Portland. My soldiers were more loyal. My bodyguard, who was with me when we were captured in Castine, came with me to work in Hiram. I work with some good people here. My generation that fought in the Revolution had the most discipline, and they were glad to serve as were their sons. Colonel Warren was a good man, and everyone liked him and his son, Captain John Warren. They built roads and bridges with the help of John Ayer and my son, Charles. Thomas Spring was ambitious and had a sense of honor. He had to, as an innkeeper, keeping the Sabbath rules and his investment straight. Stephen Tibbets was a veteran, but I could never approve of him. Twisting his orders wasn't right. The Revolution was a just war and necessary, but the War of 1812 was neither, and we lost 3 good men. Thomas Barker wasn't a veteran of either, but he served the town early and was industrious. He didn't have the education I did, but he appreciated it and wanted his children to have more than what was available in Hiram. So he moved to Portland. I miss him, but we can see him there. My grandson Henry loves to play with his twins. John Watson was another good man and a good Christian. So was his son Thomas B. Together they were tithing men for 13 years, but John was bound to the earth and content to be a farmer. There are many rewards to being a pioneer in Hiram, especially one as close to Portland as Hiram, only 1 day's ride. I am proud of my family, my soldiers, and my fellow townspeople. Just look around and you will see all that we have accomplished since I retired. Thank you for the opportunity to look back at my life in Hiram. Think of it, I saw Hiram become a legal town and Maine become its own state.
John and Abigail Clemens settled on the Notch Road alongside the 2 ponds named for them. They were one of the first settlers arriving before the Cutler and Wadsworth grants were named. Of their children, John Jr. left for the West in 1804, before most other people did. The youngest, Tamar and Delilah, died as children, but most of her children stayed. Jonathan built above the homestead at the end of Richardson Road on the backside of Hiram Hill. Eli Pope, Aldrich, and Sudrick settled nearby. Hannah, Ruth, and Eunice married Hiram men. Abigail was long-lived and was a widow for 42 years. She was revered, but still endured financial strain made more difficult by her son Aldrich, who was awarded most of her 200 acres in payment of debts. When she died in 1832 at age 104, 10% of the townspeople were related to her.
My name is Abigail Clemens. When I got to Hiram with my husband John and our children, it was pretty rough. My first encounter in Hiram was at Captain John and Mr. Lane's house on the Saco, where we stopped unexpectedly with our 6 children when looking for a place to settle. It was getting dark, too late to walk back to Brownfield. The Lanes were gracious, but obviously didn't have enough food, and we were served porridge for supper. There was not enough bowls or spoons, so the children's porridge was served in the bottom of the chair, and they ate with clamshells. One day, while John was hunting in the Notch, he found 2 beautiful ponds and an Indian mound in between. He built a log cabin, and we settled there. I came close to running out of food myself when there was a snowstorm, and John couldn't return from Freiburg, where he had gone to barter for provisions. The closest neighbor was the native Tom Hagen and his wife, and we became friendly with them. He once was a fierce warrior against us, and then with us in Revolution, but he stopped fighting after the war. After my husband died, I had no income. My son Aldrich took over in the house and made improvements, but insisted on the bulk of my 200-acre in return, and the court agreed, so I had no choice. But I gave the rest to my son Jonathan, who made no such demands. I loved my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There were so many. And I was treated with respect as a widow and an elder, but I resented to paying taxes on my property and having no say in how it was allocated to my son Aldrich. Such is life for women settlers.
John Watson was born in England in 1750. He fought the American Revolution. He came to Hiram from Kennebunk, then called Rundle, with his wife Lucy Bickford and his baby son Thomas B. in 1778, making the family one of the oldest in Hiram. He settled on the east side of the Saco River on land he bought from Henry Young Brown, who founded Brownfield. The land was part of Brownfield until 1807, when it became part of Hiram, when Porter, Denmark, and Brownfield collaborated to incorporate as towns. John Watson was a selectman in Brownfield at the time, and later was elected to the same position in Hiram. John and Lucy's second son, John Jr., was the first male born in Hiram. John was a man of fervent emotions, and he recorded these words on a pine box in which he kept his important papers.
John Watson is my name, New England is my nation, Brownfield is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation. Let me explain. New England is my nation. I was born in England, but I fought in the Revolution, and I am a fervent supporter of America. I bought 100 acres from Henry Brown, and I lived in Brownfield. My closest neighbor was John Burbank, who also came from Kennebunk. After our houses were washed away in the flood of 1785, I built on higher ground on my land in Brownfield. My house was bigger, 2 stories plus an attic, and a full basement in the newest fashion. But John Burbank moved across the river on the west side where his son had made improvements. After that, there were only 2 neighbors on my side of Saco. There were more across the river, but the only way across was Ingalls Ferry. There were 3 reasons to cross the river: John Ayer's grist mill, Timothy Cutler's post office, and town meetings at Simon Bucknell's. After 1788, when Timothy Cutler got his grant, and in 1790, when the general bought his land, more settlers came up from the coast, and there were more reasons to cross the river. John Ayer began to preach at his house, and he was a fervent Christian. And with his joiner skills, he and the general's son, Charles, built the bridge in 1805, but the roads were still very bad. I lost a lot of lumber crossing the bridge, and the town wouldn't reimburse me. We had to make as much as we could at home. Everything we ate and wore came from our farm. We even had to make our own soap. The men and boys raised and dressed the cattle, and the women and girls grew the food, preserved it, grew the flax, and combed it, and spun it, wove it, and sewed it. We did okay for ourselves, even though I had 3 children. There were only 18 families in 1790, but in 1800 there were 43. I am proud of what we built. John Watson is my name, New England is my nation, Hiram is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation.
Thomas Spring from New Hampshire was a Revolutionary War veteran, and after the war he bought property from Benjamin Burbank in Hiram. In 1792, he brought his wife Mary Osgood and 7 children to the farm on the Pequawket Trail. Today it is the old Homestead Farm. He opened a tavern there 4 years later in 1796. The inn did a thriving business because it was 12 miles from Freiburg, on the route to Bartlett, New Hampshire, and Portland. Mail carriers had to change horses every 12 miles, and the inn with its stables was a popular stop. Thomas, who had studied law, was civic-minded, as were his 3 sons, John, Marshall, and Alpheus. They had almost every town office in the early years. They were also entrepreneurial and invested in the new fad for canals, along with Thomas's brother, Seth Spring, a wealthy merchant in Biddeford, and also a Revolutionary War hero. Thomas and Mary's son, Alpheus, owned a mill in Hancock Brook, Spring and Haskell, that made 10,000 chairs annually in 1832. His daughter Susan contributed the money to build the Universalist Church in 1871.
My name is Mary Osgood Spring. I raised our 5 children and helped my husband run the tavern, as he was often on town business. Thomas held office before the general came to Hiram. It was on the committee to incorporate Hiram as a town that worked out the deal with Brownfield that changed the border in 1807. It was much easier to work in Hiram after the general came. He knew how to run things and get things done. I hated the Sunday rules of the tavern. Locals were not allowed to drink, or dance, or play games, but people traveling could do so. It was confusing and difficult to enforce. But by the time General Lafayette visited Maine in June of 1825 and was hosted by my brother-in-law, Seth Spring, who owned a tavern in Biddeford, we danced and feasted until I thought I would burst the seams of my new dress. Of course, I had to have new shoes and a new gown to show city people
that we were more than hayseeds in Hiram and could keep up with the latest fashion. I ordered silk from our store, Barker and Hamlin, who imported it from England, and I asked Dinah Williams, who was a widow and a tailoress, to make the dress and a matching cape. I was there when Lafayette presented a silver candlestick to General Peleg Wadsworth in Portland. Lafayette's visit was the biggest event in Maine, was reported in all the newspapers. It was the highlight of my life.
Stephen Tibbets was born in 1753 in Rochester, New Hampshire, and signed up as a drummer in the Revolutionary War. At the time, he would have been 21 or 22, young for a drummer, whose average age was 34. He married Mehetabel Furbish in 1788, and after she died, he married a Furbish woman from Scarborough. He settled in Hiram with a brother, Ephraim, on land Ephraim had brought from David Durgan about 1813, but not much is known about him or Stephen for that matter.
My name is Stephen Tibbets. Drums are my passion. I signed on to the Colonial Army as a drummer, and when I left the Army, came to Hiram, I played the drums for the militia. I practice every night on my farm in Durgantown, and people hear me all over the valley. I'm pretty good, if I may say so. I can throw my drumstick high over my head and catch them as they come down without breaking a beat. By trade, I am a cord wainer. That's a shoemaker. Some call it a cobbler. And I travel to nearby towns and make and fix shoes for people, carrying my leather bag of tools with me. Shoes are leather, you know, and last a long time if repaired and cared for. And they wear out fast in the hard work we do as farmers, cleaning the land and our rocky soil and walking as much as we do. But I was marked on the Revolutionary War master as a deserter, and people started asking me about showing the white feather. I didn't desert. I was a drummer. I led the troops. I was ordered to beat a retreat, and I was not commanded to halt. I kept drumming and marching till I reached Rochester.
Andrew R. Bucknell was the son of Simeon Bucknell and Hannah Burbank, both of Hiram. The Bucknells were not wealthy, but Simeon owned a grist mill over the line with Brownfield, which was later purchased by Peleg Wadsworth. Simeon was not active in town affairs, but his son Andrew R. served as constable and tax collector for 25 years, and his brother Benjamin and Uncle John held office. Andrew R. served in the militia and fought in the War of 1812.
My name is Andrew R. Bucknell. I was constable and tax collector for 25 years, but I had a scare after the first year in office. I could not collect $33.33. You have no idea how hard it is to get Hiram men to pay their taxes. I had incentive because I received a percentage of my money collected. Well, the town reported to the sheriff, and they came after me to sell my property, or to put me in jail, but they couldn't find me or any property, and they gave up and returned to Massachusetts. As they put it, in no part satisfied. I didn't let that happen again, believe me. A few years later, I was re-elected, and I paid $12.50 for the job.
John McClucas was one of the earliest settlers in Hiram, a neighbor of General Peleg Wadsworth on the River Road. He married Margaret Brown in Buxton in 1775 when he was 34. They were both from Limerick. They had 6 sons, and there are records of 5 of them serving in the War of 1812. John died on the way home from Portland after signing up 4 of his sons. Abraham and James were musicians in their respective companies. Jacob was killed in the war. Soon after, the family fell into poverty and became paupers in the town.
My name is Margaret McClucas. My husband John is as strong as an ox. He actually is an ox. He can pull a plow all by himself. In fact, the general exclaimed that he would not have such a man in his field, but he hired my sons. I have 6 sons, and we are very proud that they served in the War of 1812. We understand that it is not a popular war, but we all have to do our duty, and of course, soldiers get paid. The general's son has money and was willing to pay someone to take his place, but all my boys wanted to serve. My husband took the 5 who hadn't signed up to Portland to get them recruited. I got the horrible news that he collapsed on the road on his way home and died. He was 60 years old. I don't know what to do. I have no men to work anymore. My husband just buried all my sons at war. Jacob was killed too, but we have 3 girls in school and they must be able to continue. Betsy is 26 and hasn't got a husband yet, but she can still learn. It's awful. I have to pay taxes to keep our girls in school, but I can't vote for her district school agent or schoolmaster, let alone the selectmen. Widow Hartford is in the same situation. It doesn't seem fair, but there is nothing I can do about it. Even if all of us widows got together, the men still run things around here.
Done.
James Gilmore was an early founder. He settled with his family on Fletcher Road on Prescott's Grant, which covered most of East Hiram. Before he signed up to serve in the War of 1812, he led a peaceful life of farming. He had a wife and 7 children, and connected with his neighbors, the Slopers and the Watsons on King Street, and the Kimballs on Hampshire Street on the other side of the Bull Ring Road, which was called Christian Hill.
When James Gilmore was killed in the War of 1812, it shattered his family. It wasn't too unusual that his 19-year-old daughter and his widow died of a disease in 1816. But 1816 was called the year without a summer. The volcano, Mount Tabora, erupted in Indonesia and caused havoc all over the globe. There was frost every month of the year in Maine, starting in April when it was time to sow crops. It snowed in June and July. Newly shorn sheep froze to death. Birds froze and fell from trees. Stable crops of hay, Indian corn, and wheat failed and prices rose. Oats became so expensive farmers could not even feed their horses. Without good nutrition, diseases such as cholera spread. Subsistence farmers like the Gilmores already are on the edge, left in droves for greener pastures out west, meaning New York and Ohio. Ephraim Kimball became the guardian of the Gilmore children. Daniel S., age 16, James, 15, Samuel V., 13, David, 11, John Watson, 7, and the youngest, Martha, at 5 years old. Their property was sold and the family was split up. Truly a tragic story of war and weather.
David Durgan was born in 1749 and fought in the Revolution. He married Abigail Haynes, and they lived in Scarborough. When they came to Hiram, they were in their 50s. They had 8 children. Most were grown, and Samuel was already married when they followed their parents to Hiram before 1800s. There were 2 Durgan families in 1800, and soon there were 6. The children had children, and many settled near their parents in the neighborhood we know as Durgantown.
My name is David Durgan, and I came to Hiram more for the benefit of my sons than for me and my wife, because I saw the opportunity on the Wadsworth and Waters grants to be able to fulfill my obligations as a father and pass lands on to my sons. We Durgans worked hard on the General's farm and earned deeds to our properties. My oldest boys married and settled nearby. Our 4 youngest were still in their teens, old enough to help on the farm or to be hired out. My 3 daughters all got married within a few years and left to live with their husbands. I was proud of my sons. They sent both their sons and daughters off to school, and they had skills. The town paid my oldest, Samuel, and Jacob Lord, a neighbor, to nail part of the Cornish bridge that belonged to Hiram and to build a fence around it so people wouldn't fall into the gully created by the spring flood. But I worried when David Durgan Jr.'s family was declared paupers and Cornish asked for support from Hiram. It was embarrassed that they would be auctioned off to the lowest bidder. Their disposal was discussed at the first town meeting after Hiram became a legal town in 1814, but I couldn't help them anymore. I was 65 and too old to farm.
Rebecca Powers married Loami Baston in 1806, and was custom that they settle next to Loami's father, Daniel Baston, and Daniel's other sons on Hiram Hill. Loami was in his father's debt, partly because Daniel sold him land or rented him fields for his crops rather than making a gift of them. Thus, it was then when Loami committed suicide the week before Christmas in 1820, his father wanted payment for his old age.
My name is Rebecca Baston. I had a kind and affectionate husband and 6 children. It was a terrible shock when he committed suicide. Our oldest was a girl of 13 and the youngest a baby of 4 months still suckling. It was the worst time of my life. I was grieving and didn't know how I would survive. I had no income. My father-in-law wouldn't forgive my husband's debts. He could easily have given Loami the land rather than making him pay for it. Loami didn't leave a will, so I had only a small share of his land. Of course, Mr. Baston had the right by law and also the right to sell Loami's share to pay the debt, but our children were his grandchildren. I didn't know what to do, and I don't know why none of the family helped me. We all lived together on farms near Loami's father. My children played with theirs. The shame of the suicide and having my furniture and blankets and kettles sold, and the thoughts of becoming a pauper, where I would be bid off to board and work with someone for the lowest bidder, were awful to hear. But James Evans, a lawyer, helped me. Because I didn't know how to write, he composed a letter for me pleading with the court to have some of my possessions. When the estate was finally settled after 4 years of agony, he helped me sell my share of the property and move to a small house across the river in the village away from the Bastons. And I made sure I had a will so my children wouldn't be caught up the same way.
Thomas Barker was born in 1766 in Cornish. When he was 23, he bought land on Hiram Hill on Timothy Cutler's grant, where he was already growing corn. John Eyre was a neighbor at the bottom of the hill. Thomas married his daughter Sarah and bought his new father-in-law's house. Part of his house is the oldest in Hiram, at 6 Hiram Hill Road, built between 1774 and 1781. John Eyre was an exhorter, a preacher with strong beliefs, yelling and stamping his foot. He led the first religious services in Hiram in his house because there was no church building. Equally important was his trade as joiner. That is, he cut each joint to fit post and beams together, an essential building skill. He built a dam and sawmill on the brook near Thomas Barker's field of corn. The brook was called 13-Mile Brook because it was 13 miles from Freiburg, and is now called Red Mill Brook. His father-in-law's skills are worth mentioning because Thomas also built a dam and sawmill on the other side of town. Barker Pond is named for him. Thomas and Sarah have 12 children, and some of the names that you will hear are biblical, which were popular at the time, but little used today. Peleg is of Hebrew origin and means separate. Asenath was an ancient Egyptian goddess. Flavella was feminine form of the Roman emperor Flavius, meaning yellow or golden. Zilpha was Jacob's wife and the name of the Barker's friend Zilpha Wadsworth, mother of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, with whom the Barkers became neighbors in Portland. Thomas died in Portland in 1819 when his youngest child was 7 years old.
My name is Thomas Barker. I grew up in Cornish, but I bought land in Hiram and lived there for 23 years. I was an innkeeper and, of course, a farmer, for survival like everyone else. My farm was on Hiram Hill, and when I bought my father-in-law's house, I owned 200 acres. Hiram was not yet a legal town, but it was a district, sometimes called a plantation, but we just called it a town. It was small. There were not many people to govern. I was elected collector of taxes and constable for 1804, which I took over John Fly. I was elected selectman in 1804 and 1805, and to the Committee on Accounts in 1806. This is an important committee that decided who could get reimbursed for work done in the town. I served with other large landowners and civic-minded men such as John Pierce, John Watson, and John Spring. But I didn't want to run for office after Peleg Wadsworth came to Hiram, as he was very effective in office, and I could not focus on my sawmill business to provide for my family that is growing.
Mary Jane and her twin sister Flavia Ann were 2 of the 12 children of Thomas and Sally Eyre Barker. They were born in 1809 and lived in Hiram, where their father built a dam on Hancock Pond. That was renamed Barker Pond, and a sawmill on Hancock Brook, which was in Baldwin until the border changed. Part of their house, where their grandfather Eyre lived, was built in 1774 and 1782, now the oldest in Hiram, and is at 6 Hiram Hill Road. Around 1815, the Barkers moved to Portland, near Peleg Wadsworth House, where his daughter Zilpha and husband Stephen Longfellow and son Henry Wadsworth Longfellow lived.
My name is Mary Jane Barker. I am 16 and have my whole life ahead of me. I left Hiram behind and I live in the fashionable city. I finished my classes at Maine Fellows School. They call them dance schools because they teach young ladies in society like Flavella, Anne and me, and also little boys until they are ready for the military school. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow attended our school and we walked hand in hand to school every morning. My father ran an inn in our house and he died a few years ago. My mother took over, but she died recently, so we are orphans. My sister, who have not yet married, and my older brother, Peleg, took the Flavella, Anne, and me and Caroline, the youngest. The family needs me to be married so as not to be a burden to them. I am soon to marry a doctor who is interning in Portland. I am a little young, 16. Most girls are 18. But Timothy Eastman wants to marry me, and I will be a respected doctor's wife. I will be comfortable and live near my family.
Mary Jane will be anything but comfortable, and she will live away from her family for the rest of her life. Mary Jane was the farthest away from Maine and led a completely different life. Her new husband, Dr. Eastman, took her to Cannon, Maine, which was barely a town near the backwoods of Skowhegan, and it had a wicked reputation. But he had a boyhood dream of going west, and he finally had a chance to fulfill it. He went to Michigan first, and Mary Jane followed with their 5 young children. Of course, she was chaperoned, but even so, it was difficult, going across New England, up the Erie Canal, by sailing ship to Detroit, then by stagecoach, and finally birch bark canoe to her new log cabin home. Can you imagine 5 kids keeping still in a bumpy stagecoach or a birch bark canoe for hours? Mary Jane had 4 more children and a house in the village, but it burned down and they had to move to his property in the woods where he had managed some rough improvements. He called it Rustic Farm. Dr. Eastman was gone for long stretches at a time. He was in great demand riding the circuit by horse and on foot, healing people, and he was beloved. He was chosen to name a town, Polkton, after President Polk. People named a town for him, Eastmanville, but Mary Jane was left to cope with raising their 9 children and running the farm as best she could. It was hard work, and she missed her family. There was one benefit of being so far away. She was shielded from the shame of her brother Thomas Ayer, who was convicted of embezzling from the inn where he worked in Gorham. It was his father-in-law's inn, after which he descended into poverty. She died when she was 44. I think she was just exhausted. Later, her husband, Dr. Eastman, married her sister, Sophia, 9 years older than Mary Jane, and a widow.
I am Flavella Ann, Mary Jane's twin. When we were young, we did everything together, from playing at my parents' farm in Hiram to stitching identical samplers at Maine Fellows School in Portland when we were 9. For a time, we were quite happy in Portland in our big inn on Congress Street near the Longfellows. Then my father died when we were 10. My mother took over the inn and we helped as much as we could, but when she died, we struggled. My brothers and sisters were teenagers and married right away. Most of us moved away. Thomas Ayer, the oldest, stayed in Hiram. After his bride Sarah Fitch died, he tried running an inn in Portland, but he gave up and went back to Hiram. For a while, he ran an inn in Gorham, which his second wife's father owned, but he got into trouble, and I was glad that I was married in Massachusetts away from it all. My sisters in Portland had to bail him out. Asnith and her husband Levi Morrill from Wyndham bought his Hiram homestead and ran an inn there for a while with my uncle Noah Barker from Cornish, but my brother Noah was near Bangor and couldn't help. Sophia and her husband Stanley Nay, who ran a grocery store in Portland, loaned money, as did my sister Elizabeth Pike Barker and her husband William Rogers. My older sister Susan M. stayed and ran the inn. She was only 23, but she died soon after, and my brother Peleg left his inn in Gorham and came back to help, as did Asnith and Levi Morrill. There was a lot of moving back and forth, and, as you can see, innkeeping runs in the family. At one point, Thomas A. became a pauper, and our cousin Benjamin Barker, who was a selectman in Hiram, had to put him up for auction. Finally, the family took them back into the inn in Portland. It was sad because Thomas A. was the namesake's son, and he started out so well. Maybe he never got his lovely happy bride dying so soon after they married.
Joseph Adams was born in 1775. He married in 1802 in Gorham and was in Hiram by 1806 when he had already built a road to his house. He was prosperous. In 1809, he was taxed for 200 acres, twice the typical landholder, a house and 2 barns, plus more oxen, cows, cattle, horses, and swine than most farmers. His first wife died, and in 1821, when he was 36, he married Dorothy Warren, daughter of the beloved Revolutionary War Colonel Nathan Warren, and they had 3 more children. He was 78 when he died at his son Nathaniel's home in Durgantown.
I am Nathaniel Adams, son of Joseph Adams, one of his 13 children. I am named for my famous grandfather, Nathaniel Warren. I inherited the land near the Durgans that my father bought and built into the largest orchard in Hiram. It is now called Apple Acres. I also owned a mill with Joseph Lord that was located between the Porter Road and the Ossipee. My sons settled near me with their families. My daughters, Priscilla, lived with me. She never married and became a devoted school teacher, teaching at Tiercap and Hiram Hill schools. And she suffered mental illness for 28 years. When my father couldn't farm anymore, he came to live with us too. Our family always took care of one another.
Timothy Cutler was born in Boston. In 1765, he moved to Maine, where he was a baker in Portland. In 1775, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the Britons burned his bakery. He moved to Saco and was cheated of 500 acres of land by a private seller and by the Massachusetts legislature, who gave it to somebody else. Massachusetts agreed he was wronged and granted him 6,000 acres in Hiram and Porter. Cutler didn't engage in local politics or join a fraternal order such as the Masons, but he built a house in the village called the Bridge Below Mount Cutler, which is named for him, and he became the first U.S. postmaster in Hiram in 1801. That year, he engaged in his first political act and petitioned the legislature to incorporate Hiram as a town. General Wadsworth, serving in the U.S. legislature at the time and not yet a resident of Hiram, did not approve and stopped it. By 1806, Cutler had moved from Hiram and was a committee to strive for incorporation was approved, but failed. Hiram was not incorporated until 1814.
My name is Mary Norton, and I married Timothy Cutler in Boston. When my husband was 30, he got the urge to move north to Maine. I followed him to Portland, where he was able to buy a small piece of property on Indian Street and open a bakery. It was terrifying when the British came and burned Portland and our home and business. We retreated to Scarborough, and when Timothy had some bad luck with his land and was finally granted some justice when he was 52. When we first left the coast and became pioneers, we bounced around from Baldwin to Porter. When he was able to buy back a few acres that he had to give back to settlers in another act of the legislation, we finally settled down in Hiram in 1794, under the mountains that became named for him. We had no children and couldn't farm at our age, so we counted on Timothy selling 100-acre lots of his grant to settlers. We lived in Hiram Village for 16 years and then moved to Berwick. He died there in 1817 at age 82, about the same age as General Wadsworth when he died. We were settlers, but it was an unsettling life, to say the least.
We fadeless minds, faith that shines on.